Awesome. Welcome, everybody, to the Virginia Conservation Network's General Assembly recap. I'm going to give folks a second to sign on here, and we'll get started in just a minute. Thanks so much for joining us. All right, well, hello and welcome to the General Assembly recap run by the Virginia Conservation Network. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Mary Rafferty. I'm the Executive Director of the Virginia Conservation Network. And we are, as you probably already know, the partnership of over 160 organizations working collectively to ensure that we protect the Commonwealth's natural resources. This recap is an opportunity for you to hear about what happened during the General Assembly session. So for those of you who may not be aware, Virginia has a pretty short General Assembly session. This was a long session at 60 days. We just wrapped up the session itself at the beginning of March. And just last week, we had what is called veto or reconvene session, where all of the bills that the governor took action on, the General Assembly then sent back as either overturning a veto or amending that as well. So what we hope to do over the course of the next 90 minutes is give you a sense of what that actually means for Virginia's environment, for climate, clean water, resilience, transportation, wildlife, what happened over these last few months and what's going to be different come July 1st. So why don't I start off by just giving a couple of big picture numbers so you can get a sense of the types of bills that we saw and that we took positions on. So this graph gives you a sense of the number, just the sheer number of bills that the Virginia Conservation Network engaged with. Now, when I say that the Virginia Conservation Network engaged with it, it's not the VCN staff team that's necessarily taking these positions. It really is the 160 partner organizations that come forward to take positions on bills that they're working on and that they care about, either in support of or against. So this year, we took positions on over 179 bills. Just to give you some context, in the 2020 session, which had historically been the year that we took the most positions, that was 165 bills. So this is the most in the last 6 years that we have ever taken positions on in terms of the amount of work that was happening. This is both because there was just a ton of bills and also because more groups than ever got engaged in the process. We go to the next slide. You can see kind of were we on the offense or on the defense? For the most part, we were on the offense this year. So we took supportive positions of 134 bills and we opposed 35 of those bills, excuse me. I think this is interesting because most people have seen the environment on the defense for the last 2 years. But really, we were pretty much similarly on the defense over this past year, just as much as we were on the defense over the last 2 years. So, slightly fewer defensive bills than 23 and 22, but not by much. Of course, we had a much larger offensive agenda with 134 supportive bills, really close to our historic year in 2020, where we took supportive positions of 141. So again, just giving you context of what environmental groups overall were working on this year in terms of offense and defense. So overall, of the 41 bills, or of the bills that we supported, 41 of them passed, and 93 of them were defeated. So again, just gives you a sense of, kind of we had a big offensive push And only 3 of the bills that we opposed squeaked through, most of them with pretty significant changes to them, but still squeaked through. But for the most part, we were able to oppose the bills that we did not support. And of course, there were lots of bills that we may have put our support on that ultimately failed, but we thought were good and that were kind of things that we should be talking about overall, even if we knew that they didn't have a chance to make it to the governor's desk. So this is what in terms happened once we got to the governor's desk. This is before that. So this is what came out of the General Assembly. If we then look at the next slide, what we can see is the overall kind of positions that we took on what types of issues. So across the board, we were pretty mixed. Most of the bills that we took positions on dealt with water and resiliency, energy and climate, land use and transportation. A smaller subset of bills were good government bills, so bills about how we make our government more transparent and accessible to the public in order to allow us to advocate more successfully on the environment. And a smaller subset on land and wildlife conservation. This is really due to the fact that most of the land and wildlife conservation work that happens is done in the budget. So that's just one big old bill that a lot of different amendments come into, which is why that's a smaller subset of bills. Okay, looking at the next one, the policy results by issue area. So this, again, that just kind of breaks down where we were successful in terms of either passing, defending, or neutralizing our positions and where we had unsuccessful outcome. So across the board, we were more unsuccessful than successful. But again, most of that is bills that we thought were good that didn't quite make it across the finish line. But not all of those bills did we think were definitely going to cross the finish line. On to the next slide. Finally, as I said last week, there was a series of bills. So all those bills that did pass then went to the governor's desk, and the governor could either sign those bills, amend those bills, or veto those bills. So he signed 27 of the bills that we supported and one of the ones that we didn't support. And he vetoed 14 of the bills that we supported and amended a suite of bills. We will get into some of this in the session in terms of what these bills were and weren't. We are still waiting on some of what his actions will be on those amended bills over the next couple of days. So you can continue to go through. And now we are going to meet the experts. So those are the top line numbers. That is interesting, but it doesn't tell the whole story. What you guys are here for is to learn about what actually happened. What were those bills? What was the information? So we've got a fantastic panel. Jay Ford, Virginia Policy and Grassroots Advisor at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, Grace Rogers, the Climate Resilience Coast and Watershed Manager at the Environmental Defense Fund, Josephus Allmond, Staff Attorney at Southern Environmental Law Center, Victoria Higgins, Virginia Director at the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, and Danny Plaugher, from the Director of the Virginia Transit Association. These folks will be answering a handful of questions from me at the top, just big, broad questions. And then we'll be getting to the series of questions that folks put into their registration form. If we have time from there, we can also take additional questions that come in through our Q&A feature. We'll get to as many questions as we can, and for those that we can't, we'll try and follow up with folks offline. So the first thing I want to do is go straight into where we are now. And this actually, I'm already going off script, so you guys can thank me later. But before we even get to the highlights of what happened during session last week, we know that the governor dealt with a whole bunch of our bills and really all of the bills. The one big one that people were watching was the budget. I'm hoping somebody can just give the process for what exactly happened with the budget so we know where we are, and then we'll get into the issues in terms of what passed, what failed, and what we're looking at forward.
Sure, I'll give the layman's explanation first, so everyone knows where we're at, and where we are at is starting again. There was sort of a last minute accord between leadership and the governor's office, and the decision was made that they would create some space and time to try and work through a negotiated budget rather than going through what many of us anticipated to be a vetoed budget and then a subsequent reconvene. So what will happen now is over the next couple of weeks, there will be some continued negotiations. It appears that It will be with the same conferees that were named during session. We've heard from members like Bloxham and Carr and Torian that they're holding some dates over the next couple of weeks to bring conferees back together. They will use the governor's amendments as reference points for their discussion, but to be blunt, they feel like they have a lot of leverage, so that they're not going to be making a lot of changes to their conference report is what we've heard initially. They will then, the General Assembly, once they have an agreement with the governor's office, they will gavel in on the 13th to meet their requirements to make the budget available for 48 hours. So it will go live on the 13th, and they will plan to take a vote on it on the 15th, which will wrap up the second or the special session, as this would be a special session at that point. So that's sort of our timeline. A lot's going to happen in the next 2 weeks, and nothing has gone fully public. Outside of the committee structure, the conferees aren't really obligated to tell us when they're having conversations, and they rarely do. So we will, I'm sure some of that information will trickle out, and you'll hear from our respective organizations on how those conversations are going.
Super helpful. Thank you. Jay, anything else anybody would add to where we are in terms of the budget process? That's really the last big thing to get done in this year's General Assembly. Awesome. Okay. Well, then let's take a step back. And I'm just going to ask a couple of big picture questions to start off, and we'll do a quick round robin on our group here. But what are some of the biggest wins that you can think of this session? What should we really, as an environmental community, be hanging our hats on and feel really proud that we accomplished this year?
I'll start. The budget isn't done, but there are some themes that are emerging. And I think we can just look at what came out of introduced budgets from the governor, and then what continued on through the conference report, and assume that those are items that there's real consensus around. And so I think there's certainly some victories to be celebrated there. For the second full budget, we see full funding of agricultural best management practices. This was a long-standing gap in Virginia's budget. We have significant ground to cover in reducing water quality impacts from our agricultural sector, but Virginia was not putting money in to make that happen. So we saw this in the governor's introduced budget in December, and we see it in the conference report. There's no reason to think it won't make it out of the negotiations as well. So that's a huge win at $231 million in practices that will be put on the ground all around the Commonwealth to keep our soil healthy and our waters clean. Another area that seems to be consensus from the introduced budget back in December is the first use of general fund dollars for resilience here in Virginia. And that's $100 million for the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. It's really exciting. For a long time, we've been saying, Virginia, you have to get some skin in the game. Climate change and adaptation work has an astronomical price tag, and Virginia has been really reluctant to put some financial skin in the game. So we're excited about that, but let me put an asterisk on it. We're excited about it because that money is largely to sort of supplement the fact that Virginia was pulled out of the regional greenhouse gas initiative. So yes, it's a good thing, but it has come to pass because of a really bad decision. And so it's sort of a good and a bad thing at the same time.
Thanks, Jay. Josephus.
Yeah, I think one of our big successes this session was on shared solar. So for those that don't know, shared solar is Virginia's version of community solar. A program was created for Dominion back in 2020 at sort of a pilot program up to 200 megawatts. And so this year, a bill expanded that program to 350 megawatts. So an additional 150 megawatts of capacity for that program, and also put in some incentives for projects on brownfields, landfills, dual use agricultural facilities. So really trying to steer projects onto disturbed land, the built environment, to reduce impacts elsewhere. And a couple of additional consumer protection measures that weren't present in the statute before. And I think the most important thing that I'm most excited about as a litigator is the inclusion in the minimum bill section for the SCC, the State Corporation Commission, to consider the benefits of these facilities when they're setting the minimum bill. The last time they took a look at it, the statute only directed them to look at costs and minimize cost shifts. And so that created a larger minimum bill than we would have liked. So we think this new language will give us a much better shot at getting a lower minimum bill and increasing participation. So we increased the size of the Dominion program, and we also established a small program in Appalachian Power Company's territory, which serves most of the southwest part of the state. So while Dominion had a program created for them in 2020, APCO did not. And so this 50 megawatt program will allow folks there to start subscribing to these facilities. There's a lot of housing stock out in Southwest Virginia that's older, has old roofs that can't, host solar themselves, or just the terrain and surrounding landscape make residential solar on a rooftop not viable. And so this will give folks a really great opportunity. And then we also explicitly authorize solar leasing. So another great option to help folks go solar if they can't afford the upfront costs of the system. I think both of those, the shared solar and the solar leasing, really should be jump-started by the Solar for All funding that Virginia Energy just got from the EPA. So $156 million towards low-income solar should really boost up those programs.
That's awesome. Thanks, Josephus. More solar in more places. That is what I like to see. Victoria, how about from you? What were some big highlights from this session?
Yeah, something that I wanted to talk about during this section is not necessarily a specific legislative win, but sort of a frame for how we think about the climate movement and the environmental movement as we move forwards. I'm sure you are aware we're seeing serious escalating demand across Virginia, mostly driven by data centers, and a lot of groups, many of whom are on this call, were pushing forward legislation to consider or mitigate impacts both to our climate goals as well as our conservation goals, water quality, et cetera, historic and cultural resources. In December, prior to the legislative session, the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission resolved to study the impacts of data centers. And so this is a body that makes performance reviews of state agencies, that evaluates programs that have been set up by the legislature to evaluate their efficacy. And there are, I believe, 9 House members and 5 Senate members. It's now primarily controlled by Democrats. And so they will be looking at, and it should be coming out this year, how data center growth is impacting our climate goals, our historic and cultural resources, and just a slew of other impacts that the data center industry has on Virginia. And so while the legislative vehicles to sort of mitigate those impacts were not successful this year, I believe we should be getting the results of this study in October. So as we're sort of acquainting ourselves with this moment in the climate movement, something to consider is what might be possible when we have that information before us.
Cool. That's really helpful, Victoria. And I do know that some of that study has started to get underway. We have been hearing from folks that they're starting to get interviewed for that. So certainly, a feeling of setback that we didn't get some of the bills passed, but I think good momentum in terms of a JLARC study, that those don't get written for everything. It is a big deal. Danny, how about in the transportation space? Any big highlights from this past session?
Yeah, what we thought would be the easiest bill actually became one of the more difficult. And let me just first acknowledge the important work of VCN and all of our partners and stakeholders and companions for the important work that you do. We had a tiny little bill, the Better Bus Stop bill. There was already funding that was dedicated over the last couple of years, setting aside $7 million of our mass transit trust fund to improve bus stops. We have over 15,000 bus stops in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and some of them, particularly along VDOT right-of-way, were taking 3 or 4 years to go from being a sign in the ground to actually having a bench and shelter. And it was primarily due to a certain state agency who shall go unnamed, very similar to Voldemort, and they were the big hiccup. And so our little bill was to remove that agency from the process. They were unnecessary, they were redundant, and give local governments and transit agencies the authority to get this, to speed up this process, cutting it down by 30–40%. And it passed the House unanimously, and then ran into some challenges in the Senate where our VCN partners really came to bat and helped us work on some language. It got through the Senate unanimously, and the governor put in an amendment. There was a sunset clause for some reason added to the bill. It was 1 year, which was unfeasible for our transit agencies trying to set up a new process. And so the governor amended it, extended it 2 more years to get everything up and running. And so that also passed unanimously. But this is a bill that was on 13 different committee dockets. At one point, it basically died. I think I had to sell a piece of my soul and create a Horcrux to get it brought back to life, which is very rare. As anyone who's worked in the General Assembly knows, it's very rare to get a bill kind of brought back. But it's a great little bill. And if you don't believe it, just drive along any major transit corridor in the pouring rain, and you will see the importance that this legislation has on everyday Virginians. And the fact that we have millions of dollars dedicated to this, we just could not get through the just layers of bureaucracy to try to get this money out the door and benefiting real Virginians. And so thank you all for doing this. This is a little thing that turned into a big thing, but it passed every level unanimously. And so we're very much looking forward to continuing this work and making a difference in folks' lives. And so, yeah, that's our little bus bill that could. So very excited about it, and appreciate everything.
I watched you through every phase of that bill, Danny. You definitely do deserve some amount of prize for being able to get that through all of the places that it went.
Thank you.
And certainly we can't, one of the best ways that we can, reduce carbon pollution from transportation is by simply not driving our cars all the time, reducing the overall vehicle miles traveled. And you can't expect people to take a bus instead of going on a car if they're standing in the rain. So as a frequent traveler of the number 5 bus in Richmond, Danny, at a bus stop that definitely does not have a shelter, I thank you for your work on this bill. I'm sure it will have an impact on my life. Grace, what highlights in the resilient space from your perspective?
Yeah. Well, so, Virginia has been doing great work in the last couple of years from an administration point of view on flood resilience planning and trying to get projects in the queue to be able to help localities adapt to climate impacts. And Governor Youngkin's administration has also made some commitments to continue this work. So EDF, as well as other VCN partners, participated last year in a resilience coordination working group, which brought 39 stakeholders across agencies, industry, academia, and nonprofits to really try to come to consensus around the ideal governing structure, like the backbone to really make sure that we can operationalize resilience and pull in federal funding, as we're seeing generational funds come in with the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, and other, recurring investments from the federal government on adaptation and resilience work. So those consensus recommendations were really the backbone of a piece of legislation that passed the House unanimously and was signed by the governor which is going to create a kind of hub and spoke model with a standalone chief resilience officer. So right now that position is a double hat for the Secretary of Natural and Historic Resources, and that job alone is enough. And so this bill would create a standalone chief resilience officer position and also convene a variety of agency leads and resilience coordinators embedded in those agencies to come together and really try to figure out what their vulnerabilities are from a climate lens. You know, a lot of what we talked about was around flood resilience, but the group definitely touched on other needs around heat and other types of climate impacts and climate vulnerabilities. And lastly, this legislation also includes some really important transparency and oversight commitments that are now in the code around the flood resilience funds that we have, like the Community Flood Preparedness Fund that Jay mentioned earlier. And that's important because it's a big pot of money. RGGI, participating in RGGI for 3 years brought $372 million into the Community Flood Preparedness Fund, which had existed in a different name since 2014 and had never received any funding. And to date, over $150 million has gone out the door, being awarded to localities across the state from west of Roanoke and Pennington Gap and Buchanan County, as well as the Eastern Shore and in Northern Virginia, really like every region of the state. So it's a lot of funds that have been out the door, and making sure that there's some oversight and those funds are being distributed fairly is really important. So we were glad to see that bill pass.
So Grace, what is happening with RGGI?
So I mean, that's a great question, and I know other folks on this panel can speak to this as well. We were all really excited to see 2 different budget amendments included to try to get Virginia back into RGGI in the budget in the conference report. That was definitely a big win and took a lot of advocacy effort from across the coalition to really underscore the importance of legislators standing up and reaffirming their commitment and their intent to have Virginia participate in RGGI from the legislation that was passed in 2020. But, you know, as Jay said, we're kind of back to the drawing board on the budget, and I think it remains to be seen if we will win a second time with RGGI language in the updated budget.
I'm not above a shameless pitch here, so right now you should be talking to budget conferees and letting them know that getting Virginia back into RGGI is important. They're in a negotiation, so we want to make sure that RGGI is one of those non-negotiables for them and not something to be traded away in exchange for a priority elsewhere in the budget. So reaching out to the conferees between now and really probably the week before session, because a lot of this will be baked in, is critically important.
And when are they meeting again, Jay, to take the budget back up again?
They will be announcing it publicly on May 13th. So there will be conversations going on starting next week, is my understanding, that some of the conferees have been told to hold their calendar on the 2nd and 3rd to pick up with conferee discussion. So now is the time to get married here. And I think if someone from VCN or someone can put it in the chat, we can provide folks the list of conferee members.
Cool. Yeah. Awesome. All right. So, you know, we want to start with the highlights, because even though we kind of saw on the grid earlier that there was a lot of things that we supported that didn't make it quite over the finish line, there was a lot of small important steps that we did take that are a big deal. So thanks for all the work that everybody put into those, and certainly there's others that we're not going to have time to talk about today, but hopefully you've seen some of the roundups that we've done to talk about those. I do want to talk about, though, the other side of the coin, those losses or step backs or things that we didn't quite get done that we thought we would. Let's start with Josephus this time. Josephus, what's you know, what's still keeping you up at night after this session?
Oh, small modular nuclear reactors are still giving me fits. We saw 2 bills this session to incentivize the development of small modular reactors, what's billed as a smaller, more modular version of traditional nuclear reactors. One bill introduced by Senator Marsden, SB 454, now only applies to Dominion, but effectively allows the utility to start recovering costs associated with SMR project development costs before they would go and apply for a certificate of public convenience and necessity at the State Corporation Commission. The reason that we oppose these bills was not on a sort of technological basis, but from a ratepayer concern angle. Typically, you don't start recovering costs associated with a new generating facility, except for financing costs, until it's built and starts delivering electricity. These bills allow cost recovery before the utility even files an application to build the thing. So our concern is that Dominion could get all the way down this line, spend $500 million towards prepping a site, and then it could never come to fruition, in which case ratepayers would have just funded $500 million of SMR R&D, essentially, with nothing to show for it. The governor amended that bill slightly. So now of the total $500 million project cost, $100 million has to go through base rates as opposed to going through the rate adjustment clause. The rate adjustment clause are those little adders that you see on your bill, like Reggie Rack or RPS Rack, different things to pay for specific projects. And so we tried throughout the session to try and insert some sort of refund provision for ratepayers in the event that the project didn't come through, or some sort of risk sharing provision, but we're not able to get that through. There was another bill that was introduced by Delegate O'Quinn for APCO specifically, a little bit smaller because APCO is about a fifth of the size of Dominion, but still allows for APCO to do the same thing up to $125 million after the governor's amendment to the bill. And so same concerns there with no refund provision. There, the only sort of redress for ratepayers is a provision that requires APCO to sell the site and return those proceeds to ratepayers if they can't build the facility. That still didn't ease our concerns, because if they spend $125 million in project development and can only turn around and sell the site for $5 or $10 million, ratepayers are still on the hook for that difference. And so we worked really hard to try and negotiate these bills to a better place. I will say where they're at now as signed pieces of law is in a much better place for ratepayers than when they started. Neither bill had a cap on the number of sites that the utility could do this at. Now they can only do this at one site. And the list of project development costs in the introduced bills was pretty wide ranging, and would have allowed for the inclusion of, on our read, basically everything associated with an SMR in this early stage. And so getting those, the caps at 500 million and 125 million, while still big dollar amounts, are sort of, they pale in comparison to the cost of what an SMR could be. The one that recently fell apart in November had ballooned to $9.3 billion by the time it was canceled. So I'd say, although we don't like the bills even as they ended up, I think we substantially mitigated quite a bit of impact to ratepayers. And so we'll still be participating. SELC plans to participate when the utilities bring these petitions to the State Corporation Commission, and we're to make sure that they have to make a really good case for why this is reasonable and prudent if they're to get any of these costs recovered. So
awesome. Thanks, Josephus. And Yeah, thanks for the work that SELC has done over the years, along with others, to just make sure that we're being, prudent with how we're building out our clean energy future. Certainly, just SELC, along with others, has a long history of making sure that we are just, whether it's offshore wind or solar, kind of making sure that we are being, the best stewards as we can with the ratepayers' dollars to get the most affordable energy that we can that is also reliable and clean. So thanks, Josephus, for your work on that. Victoria, let's go to you next.
All right. Yeah, this one really hurts. So you may know the clean car standards come into effect with model year 2025. And when that law was passed, it was made very clear that it did not exist in a vacuum, and that in order to be successful, we need to bring down the upfront cost for people, and we need to make sure that the charging infrastructure is available, particularly in places like rural and low-income localities where the private market and the federal government are not necessarily immediately gravitating. So that's what this bill would have done. The Rural Electric Vehicle Charging Infrastructure and Fund would have given developers grants up to 70% off the cost to install chargers in those regions of the Commonwealth. And pretty incredibly, it was an area of immense bipartisan support in a really hyper-political session. So I think it passed the House 74 votes out of 100, passed the Senate 28 or 29. So no one disagreed on the policy. Unfortunately, a couple other sort of internal dynamics were at play. So we're operating from a budget perspective in kind of a scarcity mindset. Because of a report that the legislature had been given about our revenue coming into session, and so there was not a lot of appetite for new programs. There was also just some infighting within the parties, and so as this bill came to committee, it fell victim a little bit to that. That said, having gotten it through both chambers for the first time, and having actually gotten it in the budget with a smaller chunk of change, but a significant amount as sort of a pilot program for the first time, we are in a good place of having laid that groundwork, and I think we'll be in a good place to continue to advocate for this policy going forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Victoria. And on the flip side of that, also a big win that we were able to kill all of the attempts to repeal the clean car standards. So we can take a little bit of, excitement out of that, even though our work to then build out the clean car infrastructure that we need slowed down for a year. And thanks for all your work on that. Danny, what's happening on transportation?
Well, take this with a grain of salt because of the changing dynamic of not knowing what the budget is going to look like. But obviously, the amendments to WMATA funding, Metro funding, is something that we're keeping a hard eye on. The General Assembly set aside about $130 million to help fill WMATA's gap. They are a unique entity in the transit space. Because not only do they have to cross multiple jurisdictions, they have to actually cross technically 3 different states. And they also have no dedicated revenue, contrary to some of the larger systems around the country. And so they are in a very unique place of needing funding, kind of fill the hole, and their biggest user for commuter-based services is the federal government, and they're not quite open. And so they're dealing with a lot of challenges while trying to grow. So the governor eliminated all their funding in year 1, dramatically cut funding in the second year of the biennial budget. Hopefully, a lot of that will be changed back into positive territory when the new compromise budget comes out on the 13th to be voted on according to Jay on the 15th. I take whatever Jay says as gospel. So if he says it, I believe it. And so that is something that we're watching. Another kind of loss with a little bit of a victory is for the second year in a row, there was also an attempt, this time slightly successful, to take money off the top of the Transportation Trust Fund and have it directed to the Transportation Partnership Opportunity Fund, or as Trip Pollard likes to say, the Governor's Slush Fund. And so initially there was $200 million. Trip did a fantastic work in getting it cut down to $90 million with a maximum impact of $15 million a year versus potentially $200 million a year with the ability to refill it $100 million a year. And so that's while still a loss, there was a lot of good work that improved it to make it less impactful, but it's still going to cut transit and rail funding by about $3 million a year. And so that's $3 million for putting more buses on the roads, more trains. And so any cut to transportation, especially rail and transit funding, is hard. And so that's something that we're kind of a little bit of a defeat, but could have been worse.
Great. Thanks, Danny. And I can see there's a lot of questions in the chat box about making sure that people can get information about the budget conferees and the status of Reggie. I think, Grace, you're typing an answer in as we go. So I'm going to skip you and go to Jay and have Jay answer so that you can finish that so that we can make sure people have that question answered in the chat box and we can just send it around to everybody. So Jay, what setbacks did you feel were kind of faced from the environmental community's perspective this session that are worth kind of raising up?
Yeah, I think starting with the budget from the very get-go, there was $0 for stormwater, and that's really problematic. That's one of our main 3 sectors for water pollution here in the Commonwealth. It's also the sector that is continuing to grow in terms of impact to our waterways. And so to see the governor zero that out and the General Assembly leave it zeroed out it's definitely concerning and something that's going to be a top priority in coming budget sessions. I think another area that was very concerning is that the governor also zeroed out wastewater. Wastewater has been our most successful sector in terms of water pollution reductions. It all comes to a single pipe, so we know exactly what the impact is. So there's a lot of surety with that practice, and we've also made a lot of we've essentially made obligations to all of our wastewater facilities that there would be General Assembly support for them. And so to have that go zero out when the needs assessment over the biennium was closer to $400 million creates a huge gap. And so we're hopeful that negotiations will help address that need. On the legislative front, there was a couple of areas, but I'll focus on just 2. One is trees. This year, there was a number of pieces of legislation that would have helped Virginia to arrest the unfortunate trend that we've been on for decades at this point, and some might argue since Virginia became a state of deforestation. But in our most recent surveys, Virginia continues to go in the wrong direction. It's largely being driven by deforestation for development. Legislation this year would have expanded conservation measures as well as options for mitigation statewide. Right now, their Planning District 8, which is Northern Virginia, has authorities to hold on to trees in the development process that the rest of Virginia does not have. And so we really have an equity question when it comes to who has the right to have trees in their community. And we worked really hard with stakeholders and managed to get these bills out and to the governor's desk. And unfortunately, he opted to veto both of them. And so we're left with an unequal system across the Commonwealth in terms of what localities can do to try and deal with this deeply unfortunate and problematic trend of continued deforestation. So that's an area we will be coming back on in future years and maybe even coming back on more aggressively because, each year that we kick the can or we don't take action, more damage is done. And so there's more ground for us to make up. And then the last thing I'd mention briefly is there was legislation this year that would have helped backfill appointments to the Environmental Justice Council. And, this administration has not shown a lot of interest in continuing Virginia's movement in taking care of our environmental justice communities and making sure that we're providing a voice for their concerns to be heard. The Environmental Justice Council fills that role in providing a public forum and being constituted of representatives from EJ communities around the state. Unfortunately, this bill was also met with a veto. And then to kind of like throw some insult onto injury, it was then filled with a number of representatives from industry rather than from environmental justice communities. And this all occurs also on the backdrop that Virginia was supposed to roll out an environmental justice tool that was going to be utilized for major permits, and that has been sitting under executive review for almost 2 years at this point. And so I think in general, when it comes to progress in environmental justice, there's a lot of disappointment, not just in this session, but generally over the last couple of years. And many of us are looking towards starting to accelerate our progress in this area and get out of this sort of stasis that we've been in here.
Wow. Thanks, Jay. Thanks for lifting that up. I know that a lot of folks have been following the issue of the Environmental Justice Council, and will continue to track what these new members mean for the future of the council. All right, Grace, thank you for letting me skip you so you could finish that. I know that we just added in budget committee members into the full chat box so people can see that, both for the Reggie engagement, but also if you care about Metro funding that Danny just gave an update on. Those are the folks that will be making decisions over the next few weeks. But Grace, give us an update from your end on any step backs or things that didn't quite make it as far as you'd like it.
Yeah, so I think the biggest disappointment and the biggest surprise was even with the administration support for the Chief Resilience Officer bill, the funding for that position and for 2 additional staff was pulled out of the governor's budget somewhat inexplicably. So we're still hopeful that the General Assembly will maintain that funding since they had the budget amendment to begin with. But this came up a lot when we were meeting with that 39 stakeholder group last year. This work cannot be done without staff to help support it. And the 3 FTEs that we had in the budget was already a compromise. I think we could have 12 FTEs, full-time employees, and it still would just be scratching the surface. So that was definitely a big disappointment, and hopefully something that we can get rectified in this final budget, because we need support for local governments and regional governments to better understand which of all of these grant funding opportunities that are available, which 1 or 2 will be most best suited for them, they'll be most competitive for. And it's a lot of work to really be able to assess all of our climate vulnerabilities and needs. And so we need people to help do that. I think the other loss this year, maybe not unexpected for a first pass, and we will definitely be back again next session trying to move this forward, was a bill that would have required additional disclosures in property like forms when you go to buy a house, and then also for renters around flood disclosure. And this one is particularly a challenge in Virginia because Virginia is a buyer beware state. And so what that means is essentially it's on you as a potential home buyer to figure out what could be wrong with a house. And that means an inspection, but it also means like a lot of other information that you would really only get as the person who lived in that home. You have to just sort of figure out on your own as a home buyer. And when you're handed a huge stack of forms, like 300, 400 pages, it's really, it's good to do your due diligence, but it's also still really hard. And a lot of folks don't know how to access flood information, flood risk information. And we know also because of climate change, we're seeing dramatic increases in rainfall across the Commonwealth, and that has real implications for flood risk and, is overloading stormwater systems, and a lot of places that didn't used to flood are starting to flood now. So this bill would have really just tried to clarify, adding some additional disclosures around if there'd been prior flooding in the home, if the home was required to carry flood insurance, and a few other things. And then also bringing those protections to renters too. Because flood insurance is separate from your homeowner's insurance policy. It's frequently separate from a renter's insurance policy, and most folks don't know that. So we were not able to win this time on this bill. I think we'll definitely take some more education and some more outreach. That being said, if your home has been flooded and you didn't know that you had flood risk, please shoot me a note. I would love to learn more about your story, and we'll definitely be working on this a lot over the summer and into next session as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Grace. So, it's interesting to hear the policy updates, and it can be easy for somebody who hasn't spent a lot of time in the General Assembly building, or we say the building as a shorthand, right? To just say, okay, so this issue just happens and then it goes through and then it either passes or it fails. Or, you're kind of looking at all of the bills that VCN, so the broader environmental community, took a position on. You're like, wow, that's a lot of bills. But of course, as we know, there's so many other dynamics that are at play. So there are just, we are one slice of all of the other issues that people are, that legislators are listening to on a daily basis in the legislature. And there are so many other dynamics that are just at play in the building, and even perfectly good ideas sometimes just disappear because of a dynamic that we may or may not have even been aware of. And some that we are very well aware of, that we're fighting against every day, or partnering with to fight with. So I would just love to hear from the panelists. We can do this a little bit popcorn style, like what dynamics were at play? So outside of the policy, we just talked about the policy, but what things were happening in the building that are just worth kind of giving context to, folks who care about the environment, in terms of, what might have influenced something that we should just be aware of for the future, or just kind of know was happening in the building behind that, maybe wasn't in the newspaper. So anybody can kind of take this.
Sorry, Dan, do you want to go?
No, I was just going to say, knowing where all the committee meetings are, this was the first year of the new General Assembly, and very much like a former high school student, I got lost quite a bit. And helping elected officials find their own way around.
Yeah, I was just going to touch a little bit on the power of the Speaker of the House. So just to give a little bit of context, Speaker Don Scott rose to power in the wake of Democrats losing the House. And his sort of mindset is really laser focused on passing popular policies that he thinks are going to win Democrats elections and maintain their slim majority right now. And he really controlled his caucus with that mindset, and held a lot of the power in that chamber. So, folks on committees could get a text with the direction about this bill needs to go by for the day from the speaker, and his word is law, and he's sort of loved and respected and feared in equal measures. So as we're thinking about power building and passing some of the policies we weren't able to pass this year, have to think a little bit about our political message as well as how we build that relationship with the speaker to push some of those things forward.
Yeah. Thanks, Victoria. That's helpful. And of course, as folks know, VCN, along with many of the groups on this call, are 501c3 nonpartisan organizations. But when you work within the General Assembly building, of course, party politics are at play. So even if you are a nonpartisan organization, you are very much aware of what the party politics, how they can influence our work one way or the other. So that's helpful context to understand how those politics can impact our issues, even if we don't engage in partisan politics ourselves. Yeah, other dynamics that were at play that folks want to lift up.
Yeah, I'll just note one that I saw, and I'm relatively new to Virginia legislative work, this being just my second session here in Virginia. But something that really struck me this session was that labor is technology agnostic. And so when we were working on the SMR bills, something that gave us trouble was labor supporting the bills. SMR development bills could lead to an SMR facility eventually being built, which means jobs for their electrical workers. And so that's what they were messaging. And so I think it put a lot of Democrats in a tough choice, having sort of the environmentalists and some consumer advocates saying, hey, this isn't a great deal for ratepayers. And then on the other hand, having labor saying, hey, this is a great deal for organized labor. And so that's, I think, a dynamic that we have to be mindful of going forward, as we're trying to incentivize different technologies and trying to work to get others off of the grid. Their presence was very impactful.
Yeah. And great, I think over the years, we've been able to do some fantastic work with some of the labor unions on the important build out of offshore wind, which is getting started this year. Hooray. Off the coast of Virginia. And so, yeah, opportunities to work with them and identifying where there might be opportunities or need to build longer term relationships. That's helpful. Thanks.
I think one of the most interesting dynamics in the building was how many young people we have. And I don't mean that necessarily in their age, but we have so many new legislators this year, and it was such a warping factor in what issues could be discussed in a meaningful way. And I would group the administration in that as well. Virginia historically were a one-term governorship, so that has historically pushed administration to try and surround themselves with people who have some experience so you can really hit the ground running. The other school of thought is what the current administration adopted, which is you need to get people who have nothing to do with it so you can think outside of the box. That, coupled with the huge overturn in the General Assembly, meant that there was a lot of people who had never worked on issues working on issues this year. And it made a lot of complicated legislation much more so. And there were whole areas where the body was really reluctant to engage because there isn't enough time in our frantic assembly session to bring people up to speed and get to that level of expertise needed. So I know we organizationally left thinking we have got to spend a lot of time with these new members and continue our outreach to the administration the day after session wraps, because otherwise there's just not enough time in the building for us to get some of these more complicated items through. And so I think that was a hugely warping factor this year.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Jay. And I think that there's a lot of people probably on the call right now who run local groups or are local advocates in their communities. And much of the work that Jay's talking about is public education work. This isn't, you're not necessarily advocating for or against a bill with a lawmaker in the off season. A lot of times they just need to know, well, what does a stormwater infrastructure look like on the ground? Where are the bus stops that don't have shelters, or where's the one that's still under construction after 2 years, right? And so, I think the more that lawmakers can see and touch and feel all of the issues that we're talking about here, the more they're able to understand when you come to them frantically during session with a very specific bill, why it's so important or why we're prioritizing it. So I think that's a good thing for, to hear, Jay, from you, but I would almost use that as an opportunity and a call to action for everybody on this call. If you haven't introduced yourself to your new lawmaker, probably most of you have, but if you haven't yet, do so. And if you haven't yet reached out to them to say thank you for their work during session, please do as well.
You all can make our job a lot easier if you and we don't have questions like, oh, we can't do that. That's news to me.
Yeah, no issue too small. And full disclosure, preschool is closed today, so Jackson is making a little bit of a celebrity appearance on our call today, and I think he's out of peanut butter crackers. Anybody else have any dynamics that they wanted to share, and then we'll kind of get to the next suite of audience questions.
Well, I was just gonna more kind of to Danny's point about the building being a challenge to navigate. I strongly recommend downloading the app from the Virginia Public Access Project because they've got maps. So anytime you need to go figure out who's on a committee, where your legislator's office is, that app was super helpful for me during session to be able to rely on as I was trying to map out all of my material drops and things like that. And their newsletter also, this is kind of getting into like, how to stay engaged throughout the year. But their newsletter is also always a great roundup of news from across the Commonwealth. And their website has a lot of information, and it's really rare, I think, for a state to have a resource like this. It's definitely something that a lot of other lobbyists outside of Virginia, I think, are pretty envious of, because there's so much good information and clear information hosted by a nonprofit group, that's VPAP. So I'll put their website in the chat as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Grace.
Mary, I'd add one more dynamic just for groups that are thinking about how they can be helpful in the coming months ahead of the 25 session. Industry has probably a more unified authority over the body than they have in many past general assemblies. And so taking time to do outreach to the business community in your area and looking for areas for partnership is really important right now. The administration does disproportionately hear the interests of the business community, but also the current leadership structure within the House and Senate, because of where they are located. They're very business-centric as well. And so right now, one of the areas where your issue can really cut through is when you can bring business and industry partners along. And so it's an important strategy for navigating the building with your issues.
Awesome. Thanks. All right, we received a ton of questions as folks are registering, so we're going to try and get to as many of them as we can as a way to kind of dig in a little bit more, both kind of looking back at this past session, but also looking forward at where we're going. I'm going to start off with a broader question that I think a lot of people are hearing about, and Victoria, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but as demand is rising for electricity, as we electrify everything, and we're trying to, meet the goals that we set out in the Virginia Clean Economy Act to get to zero carbon by 2050, which is, really fantastic policy that we passed a handful of years ago. Like, what do we need to do to ensure that we get to that goal? And kind of related, I think there's, a lot of questions around, what do we need to do in terms of implementation on solar? But there's a couple of folks that ask questions about the terribly named sewer committee put together by Senator Survell. Also, Senator Marsden has started his own process. So what's happening? What do we need to do? And kind of how should folks think about engaging potentially in the process of hitting this kind of really important 100% clean energy standard that we have in Virginia?
Yeah, our climate journey is currently walking through the valley of the shadow of data centers. So that is the world that we are living in right now. The demand picture is pretty astounding. There is just, even if it is somewhat overestimated by our utilities, there is a large amount of demand that is projected to come online over the next several years. So I think, in order to actually stay on track with our renewable portfolio standard that increases the proportion of our electricity that's served by zero carbon resources through the end of the VCEA, or when we should reach 100% in 2045 and 2050, two things will have to happen. We will need to get some sort of handle on that demand, particularly in the short and medium term, thinking a little bit about sort of a comparison to the coronavirus epidemic. They had everyone quarantined to flatten the curve because they needed time to find the right solutions to deal with what we're observing as the problem. And it's the same is sort of true from the data center front. We need a little bit of time to really wrestle with the question of this demand and the extent to which we actually can meet it while maintaining our clean energy goals. At the same time, even if demand is half of what is projected, we need more on-ramps for clean electricity, and there are consensus places to do this, and then there are places where there's still a disagreement. So there are, Josephus in particular was leading a coalition that was really providing a space for some of those consensus places where conservation community, the climate community, even theoretically utilities could come to an agreement. And we, ran into logistical issues and ran into some utility opposition, but those two things will have to happen at the same time. There's going to have to be some sort of control on the speed of demand, and there's going to have to be some way to on-ramp clean electricity more quickly in more places.
Well, anybody want to add to that?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. To Victoria's point about some of those consensus solutions, I think we should be doing everything we can to maximize rooftop solar, community or shared solar, and energy efficiency. I think that's a really untapped resource here in Virginia. Dominion's time of use program is capped at 20,000 participants still. That potentially should be something that you have to opt out of, and that everyone should just be on by default, and could really shave some of that load off. I think we've got to look at things like grid enhancing technologies as well. Delegate Hernandez passed a bill to have utilities look at grid enhancing technologies in their IRP documents, but I think the next step is having utilities have to consider those in their applications to build new transmission, because something that's really important is maximizing the existing infrastructure that we have. And so if we can get 10, 20, 30% more transmission capacity out of our existing lines, that's something we should absolutely be doing, especially at the reduced cost that gets arrived at. So I think there's a lot we can be doing on stuff that, as Victoria said, there's good consensus around, and start working on some of the more difficult issues.
Mm-hmm. And just quickly, so we can make sure we do answer the question that was asked a few times: what is sewer, and what is it doing, and why did they come up with the name sewer? You don't have to answer that last piece.
This is the Commission on Electric Utility Regulation. It is sort of Majority Leader Suravel's favorite son. And he, a lot of energy legislation is complex, and lawmakers are asked to sort of wrestle with it in 45 or 60 days. So his dream for this commission is that these complex energy bills will instead be considered in a more methodical and thoughtful way. I will say it definitely gave us some trouble just as a dynamic this year, because the tendency for some issues that actually there is a wealth of research out there to support a policy that has worked in other places, et cetera, tend to get pushed off into that commission. So it is a little bit of a double-edged sword, and it still actually really remains to be seen how often they'll meet, how much funding they'll get in this new budget to actually bring on staff. So there are a lot of kind of unanswered questions about how effective it will actually be.
Thanks. There was somebody that noted an interest in learning more about the status and progress of invasive plants. This was a big issue that I think popped up a bunch this year. Wondering if somebody has a little bit more details on what happened with the series of invasive and native plant bills this year.
I like how you said popped up for invasive plants. Unfortunately, so there were two invasive plant bills. One was straightforward, dealing with English ivy from Delegate Krizik, and the other bill, Delegate Siebold and Senator Salim worked on, and that was heavily negotiated, which would have required that there be signage at the location where the plants were being sold that said these are invasive plants. And then it would have also provided a QR code so you could learn more about what made them invasive, why it was problematic, etc. Unfortunately, these bills were both vetoed. And so Virginia, we're not going to see any progress this year. I would say, adding insult to injury, the governor also cut all of the invasive plant management money in the budget as well. And this was funding to the respective natural resource agencies to help eradicate is definitely the wrong word, manage and knock back invasives on state-held properties, and again, contribute to education as well. Look, this is an issue that is 1,000,000% going to come back, and it's going to come back again, maybe in a more aggressive form of legislation. It is invasives are wrecking hundreds of millions of dollars of damage on farms and state lands and people's property across the state. They're having tremendous habitat impacts, injuring our favorite critters and our key pollinators. So this is not just a nosy neighbor doesn't like to see your invasive issue. This is something that is really transforming vast swaths of Virginia's habitat, and it is causing tremendous havoc. And so it's really unfortunate that we couldn't even take the baby step of telling someone that the plant is invasive, but here we are.
Thanks, Jay. And thanks to the attendee who is watching live to flag that there was one small step made on invasives this year, Bulova's bill to allow supervised volunteers to utilize approved herbicides to manage invasives on public lands. So one small step, and as Jay said, a lot more to do. There's a couple of process questions, and Danny, maybe you could take this one for us. It seemed to be that there were many bills that were killed in committee with the vote continue to 2025. Is this like a option just to kill a bill more nicely? Does it just mean that the bill goes away forever? Is there any kind of status it might bring to to the session next year? If somebody was tracking a bill and it now is continued to 2025, what does that even mean?
Basically, their legislator will have to decide, I believe it is in October or November, to bring the bill back for the next General Assembly. It is essentially a very friend-kind way of killing a bill. It's continuing to 2025. Most legislators, their dockets get full, and they move on to potentially other subjects. And so, yeah, it's that, and gently laying something on the table is another friendly way of saying your shit bill needs to go away. And so I apologize for cutting. Hopefully Jack did not hear that. Your poopy bill needs to go away. They're just very friendly terms of hopefully accomplishing the same thing.
Fair enough. Jack is knee deep now in Wildcrats. For anybody who has preschoolers who isn't actively watching PBS Wildcrats, you need to look at it right away. It's the most fantastic show. And then the follow-up kind of question on just process. So we kind of talked through kind of bills going through the governor's process last week. So one person was kind of tracking a bill. The substitute or the kind of amendment that came down was rejected by the House and the Senate. So what does that mean now? Does the bill become law? Does the bill not become law? So if somebody is tracking a bill right now that was amended, then the amendments were rejected by the legislature, what's the next step? What should they be waiting for?
The governor will get one final bite at the apple, and he will either sign it or let it become law or veto it. One of the things that we heard a lot is if the governor amends your bill, especially if it's an amendment that you support, and it fails, the governor would most likely veto the bill. And so if your amendments were rejected and you supported them or opposed them, that may be the most likely outcome. So the governor will get the last final action on it.
Great. Thanks, Danny. Grace, I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but one person asked, where did Andrew Wheeler go? They've heard a rumor that he's not around. So for those of you who may not know who Andrew Wheeler is, he was the former EPA director under Donald Trump. He then came to work within the administration of the Youngkin administration with, I think, a push to cut 10% of regulations. Am I getting that right across the board?
25%
of regulations across the board. Grace, have you heard a similar rumor? And if so, what do you know?
Yeah, as of I believe April 1st, he is now at a DC lobbying firm. He was always in Northern Virginia, I think. I don't think he ever moved to Richmond. So, I think this is something that we'll start to see more of, especially when we get into next year. As the Youngkin administration is wrapping up, folks may start to leave before December of next year. So not totally surprising. And we'll see. I'm sure he's got another next step planned.
I would just add that, yes, we're going to see people start leaving next year for other jobs, but this timing had much more to do with the national election. And a number of folks have gone to the same law firm, and it is widely expected that Mr. Wheeler would go into a second Trump administration were he to win this fall.
Great. Thanks, Jay. This question can kind of be asked to anybody, but are there any policies that were passed that would be kind of most relevant for local governments that you talked about, or ones that we hadn't mentioned yet that you think are most relevant for local governments?
Most of the ones that I can think that relate to the local government in our world didn't pass. So, for example, there was an effort to allow localities to adopt stretch codes for energy efficiency that was amended into something different and then is now in a limbo place. So nothing is coming to mind that is a major world change for local government from a climate perspective, but happy to be corrected.
I will add, Mary, that should the governor's amendment to the WMATA funding kind of move forward, that will have repercussions for local governments, particularly in Northern Virginia, who are part of the WMATA compact, because they will either have to see their transit service cut or raise taxes to make up the difference in that budget shortfall. So they were hoping to go 50-50 with the state by the governor's amendments, kind of eliminating this or dramatically reducing the state's 50%. That means they would have to make up a much larger share.
Great, thank you. All right, here is one more question, Grace, I think for you. I think for those, we tend to, Jay spent a bunch of time talking about some of the funding that is available for the Ag Cost Share program that is, always mostly widely thought of as Chesapeake Bay program, but that can be used statewide, right, Jay, for the Ag Cost Share program. But there was a follow-up question for folks who are not in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. What financial help is available for property owners to replant stream beds, forests, stormwater management, et cetera? Are there specific funding programs that you can talk about and how they fared this session as well?
Yeah, so the Community Flood Preparedness Fund, which we mentioned already, that is aimed at community scale flood risk reduction, but a lot of the nature-based solutions that you mentioned, Mary, are eligible for funding. And again, so it's funding going to the local government or to soil and water conservation districts. They're also eligible to receive this funding. But that's a great way to look at like neighborhood scale, community scale investments. And we also have another resilience fund called the Resilient Virginia Revolving Fund, which is a revolving loan program that provides low interest loans to local governments, and that can be passed through to individual property owners. And this fund is, similar, trying to reduce risk from flooding, but also other hazards. So, you know, looking at like heat, I think would also probably end up working with under this program, especially with the again the nature-based solutions that you mentioned. The local government needs to be able to have a revolving fund to be able to pass through to individuals. So it's a little bit nuanced. It's a new program. We have only seen one local government go after funding from that program so far. So still kind of in baby stages here. But the other thing I would mention too is the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program, VCAP. So that program is it is not restricted to Chesapeake Bay. As long as your local soil and water conservation district is participating, you can receive a grant fund, and that is really targeted towards these best management practices for stormwater water quality improvement, but you know, trees, different other types of plantings, and I think like rain barrels too. So that's a great resource for sure, and it's not restricted to the Chesapeake Bay. And then both the CFPF and the Resilient Virginia Revolving Fund are statewide funds, and they have funding in the budget. And lastly, the other thing I would mention is the Coastal Resilience and Trees Fund. This is a grant program that is co-managed by our nonprofit partner and VCN partner, Wetlands Watch, and the Virginia Outdoors Foundation. And that grant cycle, it happens twice a year. You can apply to receive funding, and that is just in the coastal zone, so not Chesapeake Bay specific either.
Awesome.
So I don't know if you have anything else to add to that list.
Cool. Thanks, Grace. That's super helpful. I want to do a couple of quick rapid fire answers on some questions. And while I'm doing this, I'm hoping that the panelists will think about one other thing that maybe wasn't covered. We're going to do a little catch-all in a second. So if you feel like there's a burning issue that happened during session that you think should be said, I'm going to ask you for it in just a moment. There were a couple of quick questions that I can answer for folks. One, people may have heard the rumor that the State Trails Office was going to move over to DCR. There was some kind of move in the budget that might have done that, but that did not happen. The State Trails Office will be staying at the Virginia Department of Transportation. So just in case you heard that rumor and were wondering what happened, it is staying at VDOT, which we believe is kind of the right spot for it for now, although good coordination with VCR, the Department of Conservation Recreation, is really important. The other question that got asked are we hearing any interest in lifting the moratorium on uranium mining in Virginia? That issue did not come up this session. There was no bill to lift the longstanding moratorium on mining in Virginia. And in fact, I think we've had some pretty successful discussions with this administration, as well as some of the champions in the legislature. But it's a bipartisan group of folks who have wanted to maintain the moratorium on uranium mining in Virginia. So that bill did not come up this year. We didn't anticipate it. We had continue to have some good champions on that issue, but we will keep everybody, on posted in case that changes. So again, kind of back to the panel, while you guys had a chance to think about this, any last things that, we either didn't have a chance to talk about or you think are important to kind of highlight as we wrap up our discussion here?
Mary, an issue that, at least from the transit agency and rail perspective, not for this past General Assembly session, but one that we will be looking forward to. Electric buses are having challenges, especially in more rural communities or longer distance. So green hydrogen is going to be an issue that a lot of transit agencies or Amtrak, commuter rail are going to be looking at. So we'll be reaching out to the environmental community on kind of having those conversations, but that's something that I think is going to be, as we try to decarbonize our network, how do we do it intelligently as a state and through the policy and legislative avenue.
Awesome. Thanks, Danny.
The only thing I would add is that we almost had or we might still, I guess, have a Virginia Clean Energy Innovation Authority what you might refer to as a green bank, basically a medium through which federal dollars can be received, and makes the state eligible for matching funds, sometimes 10 times matching funds for clean energy projects across the state. So Senator Survell introduced one, got some funding in the budget. It was sort of gently vetoed kind of through the budget process, and they're still in talks right now. But great to see that initiative from the senator, and sad to see that the outcome thus far has not allowed it to come to fruition.
Thanks, Beck.
I would highlight that an area that we're going to see come back to sessions is Virginia is one of the only states on the Eastern Seaboard that hasn't taken the time to try and develop a roadmap for wetlands. There was legislation this year to stand up the first wetlands working group for Virginia that would have looked at both tidal and non-tidal and tried to chart a path for us to turn around the fact that we're losing them at a tremendous rate, and that particularly in the face of climate impacts, we need these more than ever. This is and right now, post-SAC, this conversation is more important here in Virginia. So we will certainly be back next year to further this conversation, but I think it's something that we're going to see over many sessions as Virginia starts to take these natural assets a little more seriously, and their importance in both climate resilience and water quality and quality of life, honestly. So you'll stay tuned for more on that in the coming months and years.
Great. Thanks, Shay.
Yeah, we definitely touched on this already, but I think the rising demand is really fueling a sense of urgency among legislators and advocates that we've got to improve the VCEA or add to it. And so I think those calls will only continue to grow. I think a couple important things to keep an eye on. There's the data center study that JLARC will be releasing later this fall. And because of legislation passed in the 2023 session, Dominion will be filing another IRP in October of this year. So laying out their plan on how to comply with the Clean Economy Act while meeting that growing load, and advocates will hopefully put forward some alternative plans. Legislation going forward.
Awesome. And Grace, any?
I was gonna also talk about wetlands. Like Jay said, Virginia is has one of the strongest state level wetlands protections laws on the books, and we just need to make sure that we can maintain and defend that in a post-SAC world. And I think, going back to what we mentioned earlier, there's so many new legislators that are still going to need a lot of education to get caught up to speed on all of our diverse range of issues. So there is a lot of work to do to make sure that we can really succinctly communicate our needs and our priorities, and make sure that those are translated so that we have great advocates who are able to support us next session.
Perfect. Well, that is the perfect transition for our last 2 minutes. Andriana, if somebody wanted to take action, where would they go to figure out how to engage with their lawmaker throughout session, or what events are happening? What could somebody do?
Thank you so much for that flawless transition, Mary. I'll this up right here. So we have a General Assembly Advocacy 101 guide that can be found if you go onto our homepage and you press the Take Action button on the top, or even if you look up VCN General Assembly Advocacy Guide, it should pop up as the first result. But here you can just see first our bill tracker. So all of the bills that were talked about today and so much more that we've taken position on. You can see the status of all of them here. You can also see our events and upcoming actions, and this like action alerts, ways to get involved. You can see right here the recap that everyone's on, as well as all the events are happening. So definitely recommend to give that a look and bookmark this page. We also have training videos pertaining to the General Assembly session and the legislative process, what it means to lobby as a citizen, and also how VCN conducts our legislative process. We have a guide, and then finally our common FAQs for just throughout the year, right? Because even though session is over, advocacy does not end in the spring, right? It's year round. So we definitely want to encourage you, now is a very critical time to meet with your legislators as well, just as it was a couple weeks ago. And thank you so much.
Awesome. And I just want to give one final thank you, first of all, to our panelists who joined us and gave us the inside scoop of what happened during the General Assembly session in 2024. And of course, also, oh, you just put yourself off camera, Andriana, who organized this entire event and makes all of us look so successful for the incredible work she does behind the scenes. Thank you to everybody. Please stay in touch with us at VCN, along with your lawmakers throughout the year, and we will talk to you all soon.